Okay, so we have to do something similar to that for this one, in order to determine the answer of the greater than or less than. Okay, so let's start with the first one. Okay, so use algebra to find the solution set for each inequality. Okay, so we have x minus 1 on the top, x plus 1 all over x. Okay, so what we need to do for each of them is find the vertical asymptotes and the x-intercepts. For those who watched the video yesterday, how do we find the vertical asymptote? Or maybe you know from last year. How do we determine the vertical asymptote? Alexandra? Okay, so what makes the denominator 0? Okay, so what would make this 0? 0. Okay, so our vertical asymptote is 0. Then I kind of gave you a hint on how to determine the x-intercepts. The x-intercepts. Okay, so in the question that I did in 5.3, this was an equal sign, so we're able to cross multiply. But x times 0 is 0. So what I showed you is whatever makes the numerator equal to 0. Okay, so what would make the numerator, any number that would make the numerator equal to 0? Haley?
Plus or minus negative, or positive or negative 1.
Good, so negative or positive 1. Okay, so if I plug in a positive 1 here, I'm going to get 0. If I plug the negative 1 in the second bracket, I would get 0 as well. Okay, so now we have the vertical asymptotes and our x-intercepts. Now, for us, in order to tell us, for us to figure out what x values will be above 0 or less than or equal to 0, we then have to make a chart. Okay, so we're going to write out our chart here. Okay, so in the lesson, you guys know. Just give you guys 30 seconds. Okay, so what went in the first column? What in the first column? Those who did the lesson. What you put in yours? You're right.
Numerator and denominator.
Good, you put your numerators and your denominators in here, okay? But since I have two brackets here, I'm gonna separate them in rows. Okay, first I'm gonna put the x minus one. Then I'm gonna put the next one, which is x plus one. You could put them together in one, but it's easier if you don't. So that's my numerators, and now my denominator of x. And then the last row becomes our plus or minus. So our numerators, x minus 1 and x plus 1, go into the first two rows. The denominator x goes into the third row. And then we're going to do something in the last row, which is our plus or minus. Okay, now in the top row, so the way I started is, our lowest number is going to go here, based on the vertical asymptotes and the x-intercepts. Okay, what's my lowest number? Between the three? Negative 1, right? So what we're going to do is find x values less than negative 1. Less than or equal to. Because this one has the symbol here equals to, so we're going to put equals to there. So that goes in our first one, and our last one is the highest number. So we want lower than the lowest number and higher than the highest number. So out of these three, our positive one is the highest, so we're going to go x greater than or equal to positive 1. Now, in between, we have to do the ranges that include now 0. Okay, so we have numbers less than negative 1. So numbers less than negative 1. Now, we have to have numbers in between negative 1 and 0. So, in between negative 1 and 0. 0 is our middle value, so we'll go from the negative 1 to the 0. Okay, be careful of one thing. This one's an asymptote. Okay, so it'll be never equal to 0, just less than. It'll make sense when we have to do our answer at the end. Then our last one, what values am I going to put, do you think? Going by the pattern. Alexandra? Sorry? 0 to 1. Okay, so greater than 0 and less than positive 1. Okay, so less than negative 1 here, negative 1 to 0, 0 to positive 1, and then greater than positive 1. Be honest, how many people did not launch 5.3? Be honest. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. More? Okay, so about half maybe, guys. Okay, just so I could pace it out. Okay, so the first column, again, so numerators, x minus 1, x plus 1, and x. And then in the top here, we take our x-intercepts and their vertical asymptote. And then we're going to make a series of ranges, okay? Or series of numbers. What this means, it's going to tell us where our x values will be above or below 0, okay? Which is what we want from the equation. So in the equation, we're looking for what x values will be less than or equal to 0. So this chart where we're making is going to tell us where on the actual Cartesian plane, where the graph will be above or below the x-axis. Okay? So, give me a number that is less than -1. Easiest one? -2. Okay? So a number that's less than -1 is -2. Now you're going to take -2 and plug it into each of these. And you have to tell me if it gives you a positive answer or a negative answer. Okay? So if I put -2 in this x here, what is my answer going to be? -3. So it's going to be a negative value. Don't write the number. It's just going to be negative. Okay, so if I plug in -2 in here, I'll get a -3, which is a negative value. Next one, if I plug -2 into x plus 1, is my answer positive or negative? It is negative, because -2 plus 1 is -1. So I have a negative answer. And then lastly, the x, if I plug -2, well, it's -2, so I get a negative. Then what we do is we add up the positive and negatives. If I have 3 negatives, is my answer going to be a positive or negative? It's going to be negative. Okay, so 3 negatives makes a negative. So that means if you were to plug -2 into this equation, you'll get an answer that's below the x-axis. Okay? So if we plug the -2 here, it'll give you an answer below the x-axis. So this is going to be one of our answers. Okay, now we're going to do it for each of the rest. Okay, so now I'm going to pick a number between 0 and -1. Okay, so let's do -0.5. You can pick any number you want to within that range. If I plug in -0.5 in the x in the numerator for the first one, am I going to get a negative or positive answer? So -0.5 minus another 1 will give you -1.5. So I get a negative answer again. It does change, don't worry. Okay, -0.5. Plug in the next one, so -0.5 plus 1 gives you what? Positive 0.5. Okay, so I get a positive answer. Good? And lastly, if I plug -0.5 in x here, I get a negative. Okay, now I have 2 negatives and a positive. Is that going to give me a positive or negative answer? 2 negatives and a positive. Okay, let me ask you this. If I have 2 negatives, it makes a positive, and then I have another positive. So my answer is positive. So 2 negatives cancel out. It's positive. I have another positive answer. Okay, now continue. Now I'm going to plug in 0.5. So if I plug in 0.5 into the first one, I still have a negative. 0.5 in the second one is positive, and 0.5 in the bottom one is positive. One negative and 2 positives. What do you think that? Negative, good. And now lastly, if I plug in a number larger than 1, so let's plug in 2. So if I plug in 2 for all of these, it will give a positive, positive, positive. And if I have all positives, it's a positive answer. reason why we do the chart is so we don't have to graph this particular question. We don't have to graph them, okay? So we're looking at the chart, and the chart is asking us what values are less than 0. By doing this chart, it gives you the answer. Okay? So we're looking for what x values are less than 0. Okay, so less than 0 means negative. So my negative answers are here and here. So because less than 0 is negative. So your answers is this and this. So x, -1, and then x from, what is the questions? I do there. Sorry. In my notes, I put as an interval notation, set notation, and number line. I'm just going to do interval set notation for now. Okay, so you just write out these two answers. Please note that I do not have a line under this one. So this was less than or equal to. So less than equal to, less than equal to. But I did not put one here because the vertical asymptote is at 0, so it will never equal 0. Okay, it can be less than 0. Sorry, it will be greater than 0, but it'll never be 0. Okay, so this is our answers, those two. Okay, next one. 1 over x is greater than 1 over x plus 1. Okay. This is the biggest mistake that students make at this point. You cannot cross multiply. You cannot. Okay, when we have inequalities, we cannot cross multiply. Okay, so if this was an equal sign, like the last lesson, you can. But here it's not, so we can't cross multiply. So what we do is we move the whole fraction. We move the whole fraction. So you either move the one on the left, or you move the one on the right. The easiest one to move is which one? The one with the least amount of terms, which would be 1 over x. Okay? So I'm going to bring the 1 over x to the other side, or I'm going to cancel it out by subtracting. So I'm going to subtract by 1 over x on both sides. So I don't have anything left on the left side, so 0 is greater than 1 over x plus 1 minus 1 over x. This one's challenging. Okay. In order for us to get to this point here, so vertical asymptotes x-intercepts, in order for us to get to this chart, we need to have one fraction. Okay, one fraction only. We can't have multiple fractions. Okay? So now we have to simplify this. So we actually have to add 1 over x plus 1, subtract 1 over x plus 1 minus x. Okay? We did this last year in grade 11. How do I now combine these? What do I have to do? Actually, let me ask you this. If I did 1 over 4 minus 1 over 5, what would you do? Besides plug into your calculator. had to do this, solve this back in elementary school, what would you do? Alexandra? Common denominator, right? So you end up multiplying these ones by 5 to get to 20. Then you multiply these ones by 4 to get to 20. Okay? So you end up doing 4 times 1 times 5, and you take the 5 and you times the 1 and the 4. Okay, we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to multiply this fraction by x. Okay? So we're going to multiply this by x on the numerator and the denominator. So that's supposed to be multiply. It's the same. So we're going to multiply it by x and by x. Then we're going to do the opposite for the second fraction. So we have the x plus 1. We're going to multiply the numerator by x plus 1 and by x plus 1. I should suggest you guys put brackets around the denominator of the first fraction. So we're not going to actually expand the denominator. I'm going to take the extra step here. So for instance, just an example, you would times this by 5, this by 5, this by 5, sorry, this one by 4, and this by 4. So you would get 5 over 20 minus 4 over 20. Okay, so now we're going to do that next step. So we have x on the numerator. On the denominator now, don't expand it. So it's just going to be x times x plus 1. Okay, that's the first one. Now the second one, so subtract. The next one is 1 times x plus 1. If you want to put the 1 here, you can. Over x plus 1. Again, when you solve a fraction like this, in elementary school, what's the next step now? Haley?
Reduce.
Sorry?
Reduce. Reduce. Like cancel out.
Cancel out here?
Yeah.
Oh, no, that's if you're multiplying. Or dividing, you cancel out. Just 5 over 20 minus 4 over 20. What would you do? Don't think too hard. You're thinking too hard.
Subtract them.
Hey, subtract. What do you actually subtract though?
5 minus 4.
5 minus 4, right? You subtract the numerators. Okay, so you end up doing 5 minus 4. But what happens with the denominator? Do I do 20 minus 20? No. It stays the same. It becomes 1. So it becomes 1. So you had two 20s, now it became 1. Okay, because we're just dealing with the numerators, you keep the denominator. Okay, so that's what we're going to do here. So we have these two denominators, it becomes 1. So we just have x plus 1. Okay, don't write it twice, which is very common. So just write it once. Then the numerator, we're going to subtract it. So we have x minus 1 bracket x plus 1. Okay, you don't need to write the 1 here. You don't have to. But I left it just because there was a negative. So I combined it. X minus 1 times x plus 1. Okay, I'm doing extra steps here, by the way. And then we had the 5 minus 4, so then you actually subtract it. So now that's what we're going to do here. I'll do it on this side. So when we do this, we're going to simplify this. We're going to expand these. So we have x minus x minus 1. So if x, then a negative 1 times x is negative x. Negative 1 times 1 is negative 1. So now we simplify the numerators. The x minus x crosses off. So you're just left with negative 1, x plus 1. This kind of gets confusing. Gotta practice this one. These are the hardest questions of the whole chapter. Anyone not get this part yet? Anyone not get this part? Okay, now, before we can get to the chart, so anytime you have an inequality, we have to get to the chart. What do we need to find in order to do the chart? What has to do, we need to find?
Vertical asymptote and x-intercept.
Okay, so we need to find our vertical asymptote and our x-intercept. Great. Okay, vertical asymptote is what makes the denominator 0. What will make the denominator 0? Got it, Grace?
0.
0, okay, that's the first one. So if I plug 0 into this first x, 0 times the whole thing will be 0. So my vertical asymptote is 0. Any other options? Go ahead.
Negative.
-1, good. So if I plug -1 into the second x, it'll make the whole bracket 0, which is now -1. Now for the x-intercept, it's what makes the numerator 0. Is there anything that can make the numerator 0? Can I multiply this by anything to make it 0? I don't have an x. So I don't have an x, there isn't anything I could do to make it 0. So there isn't any. Okay, there isn't. Put none or any. There isn't an x in the numerator, so we don't have any x-intercepts. So we're just going to deal with the 0 and the -1. So in our chart, we're still putting our numerator, which is -1. Let's see why. Still putting my -1. Then I put my two denominators, two terms. I have x and x plus 1. You'll see why I included the -1. Okay, now on the top here, so I have two numbers, so I'm going to have 3 rows. Whatever your numbers is, just add an extra row. So if you have 3 numbers, 4 rows. Sorry, 4 columns. I have 2 numbers, so I'm making 3 columns. Okay, so my first one is all my x values lower than my lowest value. Okay, what's my lowest value that I have here? on my vertical asymptotes. The lowest is -1. Okay, so I'm gonna have x values less than, oh, I forgot my, no, less than -1. The question didn't have an equal to here, so I'm not putting it in my solution at all. Okay, there's no equal to here in the question, so there shouldn't be any along here. So lower than your lowest number, so less than -1. The last one is everything higher than your highest number. So our highest number in this case is 0, so greater than 0. And then in the middle, it's between the two. So greater than -1, but less than 0. And the trick is this one here at the top. Some of you guys are probably thinking, what do I do with this one? Any suggestions? Negatives throughout. Good, Emma. So negatives right through, because there isn't any numbers I could plug in here. So it's not going to change. It's going to be -1 regardless. So just negative, negative, negative. Because my numerator is always going to be -1, so negative, negative, negative. Okay, so if I plug values less than -1, so -2, I'll get negative, negative. Three negatives is negative. Plug the -0.5, I'll get negative and then positive. Two negatives and positive is positive. And lastly, if I plug a number greater than 0 in an x, I'll get a positive and a positive. Two positives and negatives gives me a negative. Okay, so now my question to you guys. Which ones are we going to take? So it's either going to be these two or this one. So are we looking for values less than 0? Or are we looking for values greater than 0? Okay? What's the answer? Are we looking for values less than 0 or values greater than 0? Alexandra? Less than. And how did you get that? Yeah, so we're reading it this way. So your x is on this side. So your x's are here. So x is less than 0. Okay? So x is less than 0. So we're taking the values that are less than 0, which are here and here. So x is less than -1 and x is greater than 0. So when I plug in those x values, my whole thing will be negative. Okay, we're gonna do one more. I'm just gonna start you guys off, and then I want you to work through the steps, because we're kind of stuck on time a bit. Can I erase? Anyone still copying this? Marquise? Good? Last one. Last one. So B is the hardest one, when you have two fractions on either side. Okay, so we already have the one fraction, okay? So we don't have to bring anything to left side, right side, okay? It's when you have two fractions on separate sides, then you have to bring them all over to one side, either the left or the right. Okay, the fraction's already here. Okay, one thing I want you guys to do here though, we have a quadratic in the numerator, we're gonna factor them. Because when we factor them, it'll make the chart easier, and then it's also easier to find the x-intercepts. So let's factor the numerator. Two numbers that multiplied at -8 and add up to 2. Got it? Oh, did I just lay on me? Come on, Sarah, you got it. Positive 4 and -2, good. So positive 4 and -2. So two numbers that multiplied at -8 and add up to 2. Okay, now I want you guys to go through the steps. Vertical asymptote, what makes what makes your denominator 0? Your x-intercepts, what makes the numerator 0? And then do your chart.